325 CE. A council hall in Nicaea, the air thick with incense and arguments. Bishops gathered to decide the nature of Christ. A theologian named Arius insists Jesus isn't divine. The hall erupts. Voices collide. No one listens. One man stands silent. A bishop from Myra, Nicholas. He walks across the room without a word and punches Arius in the face. A single act that should have ruined him. This is the man we turned into Santa Claus. The punch is one of the least violent moments in his story. This is where power learns to smooth history's edges, where resistance becomes decoration, where a man who challenged empire becomes a mascot for retail season. Same species, different branding. Myra, early 4th century. A coastal town on the edge of the collapsing Roman Empire. And collapse wasn't abstract, it was physical. Years of famine, rotting grain, families selling children to pay tax arrears, pirates raiding villages and vanishing with half the population. Roman officials arriving to collect debts and leaving with livestock, tools, or daughters. Soldiers roaming the countryside unpaid, taking whatever they needed to survive. The empire still existed, but only in the way a dying star still shines, bright on the outside, hollow at its core. Nicholas grows up here. He loses both parents young. Everything they owned falls to him. Most people would have disappeared into quiet comfort. Not Nicholas. He gives the wealth away, quietly, strategically. He doesn't throw coins for spectacle. He intervenes to stop collapse. One story says a father, bankrupt from taxes and famine, planned to sell his daughters into prostitution. Nicholas goes to his house at night, drops a bag of gold through the window. No sermon, no judgment, just survival. The story is told now like a children's fable. In Nicholas's lifetime, it was a sign of desperation, a symptom of an empire that couldn't feed its people. Eventually, Nicholas becomes Bishop of Myra. And in this era, a bishop wasn't a kindly priest in a robe. He was a shield. Rome's governors were corrupt. Courts took bribes. Tax collectors seized anything not nailed down. Soldiers treated towns as supply depots. A bishop with the backing of the community could challenge them and survive. Nicholas used this power often. 3 Roman officers were falsely accused of conspiracy. The governor wanted a quick execution. Evidence didn't matter. Truth didn't matter. Only efficiency. The men were dragged to the execution ground. Nicholas marched into the quarry, pushed through the crowd, and grabbed the executioner's blade mid-swing. Bare hands, bare defiance. And he refused to move. The execution halted. The governor backed down. The officers lived. This wasn't gentle piety. This was a man willing to confront empire with his whole body. Word spread. Sailors began carrying his name across the Mediterranean. Because sailing the 4th century sea was gambling with your life. Storms, pirates, reefs that swallowed ships whole, Roman patrols that might conscript your crew. One story says a ship caught in a violent storm called on Nicholas, and the winds died. Miracle or luck? What mattered was belief. Nicholas became a protector in a world where protection was almost non-existent. Then famine returned. Several ships arrived in Myra loaded with grain. None of it belonged to the city. It was bound for Alexandria. Roman law forbade unloading even a single bag. People were starving. Nicholas ordered the sailors to unload everything. The sailors refused. If anything was missing when the cargo reached Alexandria, they'd be punished, harshly. Nicholas promised divine protection, but what he really promised was himself, his authority, his willingness to face the governor directly. The sailors obeyed. The grain fed Myra through the famine, and when the ships arrived in Alexandria, the records claim the full amount was delivered. Then Nicaea. Arius speaks. Nicholas listens. Something breaks. He crosses the hall, strikes him in front of the emperor's representatives. Nicholas is stripped of his vestments, thrown into a cell, his beard shorn off as humiliation, left in the dark, chained. Early church prisons weren't polite. They were damp, vermin-filled rooms where starvation was common. Nicholas sat there until the council was ready to forget him. But Myra didn't forget. He was restored quietly, almost certainly because the people refused to accept another bishop. He was too beloved, too feared, too necessary. Even his failures were forgiven. As he aged, the stories multiplied. He confronted raiders on the coast, stopped soldiers from looting, freed prisoners who had been condemned without trial, mediated disputes that could have turned into bloodshed. The details blur in the records, but the pattern remains. When corruption struck, Nicholas stepped into it. When violence threatened, Nicholas met it. When collapse loomed, Nicholas pushed back. He becomes a legend in his own lifetime. When he dies around 343, Myra mourns him like a fallen emperor. But the centuries weren't kind to the city he spent his life protecting. Earthquakes, Arab raids, economic decline, a plague that emptied whole neighborhoods, trade routes shifting away, fields drying into dust. By the 11th century, Myra was barely a shadow of itself, vulnerable, weakened, forgotten. And that's when the sailors came. 1087 CE. Italian merchants, or at least that's what they pretended to be. Rumors said Myra held the bones of a powerful saint, Nicholas, and relics meant money, pilgrims, church prestige, trade. So they arrived as pilgrims, prayed politely, and when the clergy let their guard down, the sailors forced their way into the church. They broke into Nicholas's tomb with iron tools, hammered the stone, shattered the seal, opened the sarcophagus. Inside, the bones were wet. Medieval writers described a sweet-smelling liquid, manna, seeping from them. In reality, it was decomposition fluid. They scraped the bones out by hand, dropped them into a wooden crate. Locals tried to intervene. The sailors beat them back with clubs. Nicholas, who spent his life protecting Myra, left the city for the last time as stolen cargo. He was carried over land and through desert heat, a decomposing saint in a travel box, guarded not by faithful followers, but by sailors with knives. They delivered the bones to Bari, and overnight, Myra's own bishop became the property of another city. Pilgrims flocked to Bari. Money followed. Myra received nothing, just absence. Over centuries, the legend of Nicholas grew, while the reality of Nicholas dissolved. Sailors made him their patron. Northern Europeans fused him with winter folklore. The Dutch softened him into Sinterklaas. America rounded his features, brightened his clothes, and placed him in a sleigh. A bishop who confronted empire became a symbol of generosity. A man who grabbed an executioner's blade became a figure who rewards good behavior. A protector of the poor became a mascot for shopping malls. It wasn't malicious, it was pattern. We smooth the past so we don't have to think about it. We turn the violent into the gentle. We turn the complex into the comfortable. We turn collapse into Christmas. We know who Nicholas was. Sources survive. What's lost is the model. Nicholas used authority to confront injustice. He intervened in the exact cracks where empire failed, where starvation pushed families to desperation, where governors exploited the vulnerable, where soldiers abused their power. His compassion wasn't soft. It was confrontational, surgical, risky. That version disappears. We keep the outfit. And Myra? It never recovered. Raiders, plague, earthquakes. By the Ottoman period, it was little more than ruins and memory. The city died. The bishop survived as myth. But not his story, just his silhouette. The man who defied governors becomes a figure who hands out gifts. The man who stopped executions becomes a mascot for retail season. The man who fought collapse becomes a cartoon on holiday packaging. Power doesn't need to erase its resistors. It just needs to wait long enough to rebrand them. Strip the confrontation. Keep the warmth. Make defiance safe for children's books. By the time you're putting his face in a shopping mall, the transformation is complete. Same species, same mistakes. Case closed.